One Spanish American War cavalry bugler who played charge while his horse was shot under him, then blew taps for the dead into a horn full of blood and kept playing, was the framed print hanging in my grandfather's study, a dusty relic that I didn't understand until I found myself in a Humvee in the middle of a nowhere that felt older than history itself. I used to stare at that picture when I was 10, sitting on the braided rug, tracing the lines of the artist's rendering, the horse mid-collapse, the soldier's posture unnaturally rigid, the bugle catching the light. I thought it was just a story about bravery, the kind they put in textbooks to make the misery of it all look like a painting. I didn't know that blood, when it's hot, is a lot stickier than people want to believe, and it doesn't clean off brass as easily as a cloth and some polish. I was just a kid from a town in Ohio where the biggest crisis we ever faced was the high school football team losing their opening game to a school 3 towns over. My dad was a mechanic who smelled like diesel and unfiltered cigarettes, and my mom was the kind of woman who had a prayer for every storm and a casserole for every funeral. We had a porch with a screen door that slammed with a specific, rhythmic rattle that I can still hear if I close my eyes tight enough. I was 21, I had a girl named Sarah who smelled like vanilla lotion, and I thought the world was a map that I was finally allowed to start coloring in. I enlisted because I wanted to be part of something that moved the needle, something that made the ground beneath my feet feel like it had been earned rather than just inherited. I didn't think about the cost. Who does? You're 21, you've got a clean haircut, your boots are still stiff enough to cause blisters, and you think you're invincible because you haven't seen any evidence to the contrary. I remember the bus ride to Fort Benning, the way the air conditioning felt too cold, and the guys around me were all trying to look like they weren't terrified. We were loud, then we were quiet, then we were just looking out the windows at a landscape that looked like a blurred-out version of the life we'd just left. The guy sitting next to me was named Miller. He had a stack of Polaroids of his little sister tucked into his plastic baggie, and he kept looking at them like they were a map to a place he was worried about losing. We didn't talk about the future. We talked about cars and girls, and how much we hated the taste of the coffee at the bus station, which was essentially burned water. Looking back, that was the last time I felt like a civilian. That was the last time the world made sense as a series of planned steps: college, career, marriage, house, kids, retirement. Everything after that was just a series of reactions to things I didn't see coming. My training was supposed to prepare me, and in some ways it did. It taught me how to clean a rifle until my fingers bled, how to march until my arches screamed, and how to operate on 2 hours of sleep like it was a normal way to exist. But they couldn't teach the silence. They couldn't teach the way the desert air at night feels like it's holding its breath, or the way you start to recognize the scent of a place before you even arrive there, a mix of parched dust, ozone, and that metallic tang that hangs in the air whenever something goes wrong. I remember the first time I set foot in the FOB. It was like stepping onto the surface of another planet, one that had been discarded by God. The sky was too big, the sun was too bright, and everything was covered in a fine layer of grit that got into your hair, your gear, and eventually into your lungs. We were there to be the backbone, the guys who held the line, the ones who went out on patrols that were meant to be routine until they weren't. We were a unit, a collection of guys who came from places like Ohio, Georgia, Oregon, and New York, all of us mashed together in a pressurized tube of shared anxiety and dark, twisted humor. I remember Miller trying to fry an egg on the hood of a transport vehicle just to see if the rumors were true. It didn't work. The egg just sort of turned into a rubbery, inedible mess, and we laughed for 20 minutes like it was the funniest thing that had ever happened on Earth. That laughter wasn't about the egg. It was about the fact that we were alive and we were hungry, and for that one brief moment, we weren't thinking about the patrol we had to lead at dawn. I loved those guys in a way that I still can't define. It wasn't like loving a brother, because with a brother, you have a lifetime of baggage. With them, you had the raw, exposed version of a man. I knew who was afraid of spiders, I knew who sent money home to pay off a student loan, and I knew who spent his nights staring at the ceiling, thinking about the life he was afraid he wouldn't be able to return to. We were a brotherhood of the uncertain, held together by the thin hope that if we just did our jobs right, we'd all get back to that porch with the screen door. The mission started slow, a monotonous cycle of checkpoints and eyes-on-the-horizon duty. You sit there, you watch, you wait. The tension is a low-frequency hum that never goes away. You're constantly scanning, your brain working through 1,000 scenarios every single minute. If this happens, I do this. If that happens, I move there. It's exhausting, but it's a controlled exhaustion. It's when the silence breaks that the real work begins. I remember the first time we took fire. It wasn't like a movie. There was no grand orchestral swelling, no slow-motion descent into cover. It was just a sharp, sudden crack, the sound of the world tearing open, and then the air was alive with things you couldn't see. My body did what it was trained to do before my mind even registered the danger. I was down, I was moving, I was shouting commands that sounded like someone else's voice. And later, when the dust settled and the adrenaline started to drain out of my system, I remember sitting behind a wall, my hands shaking so hard I couldn't light a cigarette. Miller sat down next to me. He didn't say a word. He just handed me his lighter, his own hands perfectly still. I felt a surge of gratitude so sharp it almost knocked the wind out of me. That was the thing, we weren't just soldiers. We were buffers against the dark. But the dark has a way of leaking in, no matter how hard you push back. The patrols became longer. The intel became murkier. You start to notice things that don't fit, the way a shopkeeper looks at you just a second too long, the way the road seems empty in a way that feels intentional. It's the waiting that breaks you. You go out, you come back, you eat, you sleep, you wake up and do it again. You stop thinking about home because home feels like a dream you had once, a long time ago. You stop thinking about the future because the future is the next 10 minutes. I started to understand why my grandfather had that bugler picture on his wall. It wasn't about the glory of the charge. It was about the fact that even when your horse is gone, even when the world is ending, you keep the sound going because it's the only thing that proves you're still there. You play the music, you perform the ritual, you hold onto the discipline because the moment you let go, you're just another casualty in a story that nobody will ever really read. I kept a journal back then, a small notebook with a battered cover that I kept in my vest. I never wrote about the combat. I wrote about the way the light hit the hills at dusk, and how the taste of the canned peaches they gave us felt like a luxury, and the sound of the wind through the wire fences. I wanted to remember the human parts of it, the parts that were still me. But the war had a different set of priorities. It wanted to consume the things that made me feel normal, one by one. I remember a call home. Sarah sounded small, far away, like she was talking from the bottom of a deep well. I couldn't tell her what the air smelled like after a blast, or how the silence of the night could be louder than the chaos of the day. So I lied. I told her I was fine, that it was mostly boring, that I was just waiting to come home. I could hear the hesitation in her voice, the way she was trying to bridge the distance between our two worlds, and it made me feel a kind of cold, hollow ache that I couldn't name. There was a day, somewhere in the middle of our tour, that everything changed. It wasn't a day that started with a bang. It started with a briefing in a room that smelled like stale coffee and old sweat. We were tasked with a route clearing, a simple enough job on paper, but the air in the room felt heavy, charged with a premonition that none of us wanted to name. The lieutenant was pointing at a map with a pen that had a cracked casing, and his hand was steady, but his eyes were darting around the room, checking us, checking the atmosphere. He said the word unstable, and I felt a chill run down my spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. We loaded up into the vehicles, the routine so ingrained that it felt like a dance we'd rehearsed 1,000 times. I remember climbing into the back of the lead Humvee, the metal cold against my legs, the familiar weight of my gear settling into the spaces of my body. Miller was sitting across from me, and he was humming some song I couldn't quite place. He stopped, looked up, and caught my eye. He smiled, that tired, genuine smile that meant he was still the guy who had shared his chocolate bar with me 3 days ago. He didn't say anything, but he tapped the side of his helmet as if to say, "Stay sharp." I nodded, and then the vehicle surged forward, the engine roar drowning out the world. We moved out into the blinding glare of the morning, the heat already rising off the asphalt in shimmering waves. I checked my weapon, checking the safety, checking the magazine, doing it all by feel, my eyes fixed on the horizon. The road stretched out before us like a fuse. I looked at the guy next to me, his knuckles white against his rifle, and I wondered if he was thinking about the same thing I was, that today felt different, that the air felt thinner, like the world was waiting for something to happen. I thought about the bugler in the picture, the way he had kept playing even when the world fell out from under him. I wondered if I could do that. I wondered if any of us could. The silence in the vehicle was heavy, absolute, broken only by the vibration of the road and the distant, muffled sound of the desert wind. We hit a stretch of road where the sand had drifted over the surface, and for a second the tires lost their grip. The vehicle fishtailed, a lurching, stomach-turning movement, and I braced myself, my hand automatically going to the frame. The driver cursed under his breath, corrected the wheel, and we kept moving, the tension in the cab ratcheting up another notch. I looked out the narrow window, the landscape a blur of brown and gray, and I felt that same strange sense of dissociation I'd been experiencing more and more lately, the feeling that I was an observer of my own life, watching myself move through a landscape that didn't belong to me. My radio crackled to life, a burst of static followed by a command that sounded like it was coming from under miles of water. I grabbed the handset, the plastic warm and greasy, and confirmed. My heart was thumping against my ribs, a steady, rhythmic warning. We were approaching the bridge, the one that had been the focus of so much anxiety in the last few briefings. The bridge that held the weight of all our fears. I looked over at Miller. He had stopped humming. He was staring out the window, his expression unreadable, his jaw set in a line of grim concentration. I wanted to say something, anything, just to break the suffocating pressure of the moment, but the words died in my throat. The bridge appeared on the horizon, a skeletal structure of rusted steel against the harsh blue sky. It looked like a tombstone. I felt a sudden, sharp need to be anywhere else, to be back on that porch, to hear the sound of my dad's truck pulling into the driveway, to smell the rain on the pavement in Ohio. But the vehicle rolled on, the distance between us and the bridge shrinking with every revolution of the tires. The driver slowed, his posture shifting, his hands tight on the wheel. I could see the sweat beading on his forehead, reflecting the light like tiny, translucent beads. The radio buzzed again, a frantic sequence of orders that made no sense in the context of the mission. Then everything went perfectly still. It was the kind of stillness that precedes a hurricane, the kind that feels like a physical weight pressing against your chest. I leaned forward, my breath hitching in my throat, my eyes locked on the space just ahead of the vehicle. Miller moved his hand, reaching for something in his pocket, his movements slow and deliberate. I watched him, mesmerized by the simple human nature of the gesture, and in that moment the world stopped moving, the road disappeared, and there was only the sound of my own heartbeat, loud and insistent in my ears. The lead vehicle ahead of us suddenly swerved, the tail lights flashing once, then twice, and the air seemed to shiver. I felt the first ripple of the impact before I heard it, a dull thud that resonated deep in my bones, and then, for a split second, the world held its breath before the roar began. I reached out, my fingers brushing the strap of Miller's gear, and he looked at me, his eyes wide and clear, reflecting a sky that was suddenly full of fire. I knew then that the map I'd spent my life coloring in was gone, and there was no way to redraw it. I closed my eyes, and for the briefest, most devastating moment, I heard the faint, distant sound of a bugle, clear and sharp, cutting through the smoke. The blast didn't sound like the movies. It wasn't a roar or a cinematic boom that knocked the wind out of you. It was a physical displacement of reality, a sudden, violent vacuum that sucked the air out of the Humvee and replaced it with a pressure that felt like being crushed by the ocean floor. The world turned white, then gray, then the color of dry, pulverized earth. My ears didn't ring, they just quit, replaced by a high-pitched, electric hum that felt like a needle digging into my brain. The vehicle bucked, a metallic scream of shearing steel grinding against concrete, and then we were airborne, weightless for a heartbeat, before gravity reclaimed us with a bone-jarring slam that threw everything inside into a chaotic, tangled mess. I remember the smell first. It wasn't just burning diesel and sulfur. It was the sharp, metallic tang of pulverized wiring and the sudden, sickening scent of hot, fresh copper. Blood. I hit the floor hard, my shoulders slamming into the radio rack, but my body didn't register pain. It was just a frantic, animal need to find the air. I scrambled up, pushing off a tangle of gear and loose debris. My vision was clouded with a thick, choking veil of dust that tasted like old graves. I couldn't hear, but I could see the light filtering in through the shattered door frame, a harsh, jagged sliver of the afternoon. I lunged for the exit, my boot slipping on something wet, and shoved the mangled door until it groaned and gave way. I tumbled out onto the hot, unforgiving asphalt of the bridge. The heat hit me like a physical blow. The world outside was a kaleidoscope of broken, burning things. Our lead vehicle was a carcass, a smoking ruin of twisted armor and shredded tires, lying on its side like a discarded toy. I scrambled toward it, my lungs burning, the dust stinging my eyes until they watered, but I didn't wipe them. I couldn't take my eyes off the wreckage. Miller was there, but he wasn't Miller. He was sprawled near the embankment, his uniform shredded, the familiar desert tan turned to a deep, dark crimson. I reached him, my hands moving without permission, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard it felt like it would shatter my sternum. I grabbed his shoulder, expecting him to groan, to curse, to crack some dark joke about how we were going to get back at someone for this, but he just stared up at the sky, his eyes wide and vacant, reflecting the thick black smoke billowing from the engine block. I don't know how long I knelt there. Time didn't exist. There was only the sound of the wind, a low, mournful whistle through the wreckage, and the popping of cooling metal. I called his name, but I couldn't hear my own voice. I touched his face, feeling the grit and the heat of his skin, and I saw the Polaroids, the ones of his sister, scattered across the road, curled and blackened by the heat. I picked one up, my fingers shaking so violently I almost tore it. It was a picture of a little girl in a yellow dress, standing in front of a swing set in a yard that looked like 1,000 yards in Ohio. I just held it. I couldn't look away, and I couldn't look at him. I couldn't do anything but sit there in the middle of the apocalypse, holding a scrap of paper that represented a world that felt like it had been erased. I don't remember the extraction. I don't remember the medical team or the stretcher. The next thing I knew, I was sitting on a crate in the supply yard back at the FOB, staring at my hands. They were caked in dry, dark mud and Miller's blood. I didn't wash them. I just sat there, watching the sun dip lower, turning the sky a bruised, angry purple. The base was a hive of activity, people shouting, trucks revving, radios squawking with that frantic, high-pitched urgency that means everything and nothing all at once. Nobody looked at me. Nobody dared to. We were a unit, and when a part of the unit goes dark, the rest of the machine just keeps grinding, trying to maintain the illusion of function. I felt an intense, irrational anger at the men walking past, at the guy loading ammunition into a crate, at the cook smoking a cigarette by the mess tent. How were they still doing these things? How could they exist in a world where Miller wasn't humming, where the air didn't smell like copper? It felt like a betrayal. It felt like I was the only person in the world who had actually seen the sun set, while everyone else was just going through the motions of another Tuesday. I started to laugh. It wasn't a real laugh. It was a dry, hacking sound that escaped my throat, a reaction to the sheer absurdity of the fact that I was hungry. I was starving. My body needed food, even as my mind felt like it was dissolving into the dirt. I stood up, my legs feeling heavy, like they were made of lead, and walked toward the mess hall. I walked past the spot where we had tried to fry the egg, and I saw the dark, burnt patch on the concrete. I stopped. I stared at it until my eyes ached. I could see the ghost of us there, laughing at that stupid, ruined egg, the world still feeling like a map we were going to color in. I felt a surge of grief so sharp, so overwhelming, that I had to grab the side of a metal storage container to keep from falling. I didn't cry. I had forgotten how. I just stood there, my forehead pressed against the cold, corrugated steel, breathing in the smell of jet fuel and rot, and I waited for the world to stop spinning. But it didn't. It just kept turning, uncaring, vast, and silent. The night that followed was the longest one of my life. I lay on my cot, my eyes wide, staring at the canvas roof. Every time I closed them, I saw the bridge. I saw the light reflecting off the twisted steel, I saw Miller's eyes, and I heard the sound of that bugler again, a ghost note in the dark. I didn't sleep. I just lay there, the hum of the base generator vibrating through the frame of the bed, a constant, low-frequency reminder that I was still here. I reached into my pocket and touched the photograph of the girl in the yellow dress. It was soft, the edges worn away from the heat and the movement. I had shoved it into my vest without thinking, a reflex, a desperate attempt to carry something that mattered. I realized then that I wasn't going to give it back. There was nobody left to give it to. I was the curator of this piece of someone else's life now, a silent witness to a future that would never happen. I felt a cold, hard knot of resolve form in my chest, a feeling that wasn't hope and wasn't despair, but something in between, a grim, hollow endurance. Morning came with the same relentless brightness. I went through the motions. I cleaned my rifle, I checked my gear, I ate the same tasteless rations. I didn't speak to anyone. My squad mates were there, but they were shadows, silhouettes of the men they had been 24 hours ago. We looked at each other and looked away, the shared secret of our survival, a wall between us that we couldn't climb. We were all carrying the same piece of the sky, the same piece of the bridge, and none of us knew how to talk about it without shattering. I remember the lieutenant coming by, his face lined with a fatigue that looked like it had been carved into his skin with a chisel. He didn't say much. He just clapped a hand on my shoulder, a heavy, awkward gesture that meant to convey something he couldn't put into words, and walked on. I watched him go, and I felt a strange, detached pity for him. He was the one who had to write the letters. He was the one who had to answer to the ones who weren't here. I was just the one who had to keep living in the aftermath. I was tasked with guard duty that afternoon, a long, lonely stretch in a watchtower that overlooked the perimeter. I climbed the ladder, the metal biting into my palms, and took my position. Below, the desert stretched out, a vast, indifferent expanse of dust and shadow. I scanned the horizon, my eyes stinging from the glare, my mind a blank white screen. A supply truck rolled in, dust kicking up in a long, tan plume behind it. I watched it, a mundane, mechanical action, and for a moment I felt like a ghost, a spectator in a world I no longer recognized. My phone was in my pocket, the one I used to call home. I took it out and looked at the screen. No signal, of course. Why would there be? I felt a sudden, desperate urge to hear a voice, to hear Sarah's laugh, to hear the sound of the screen door back in Ohio, but the distance was too great. The war had created a canyon between us, and I wasn't sure if there was enough of me left to build a bridge across it. The radio buzzed, the voice of the base commander crackling through the air, asking for a status report. I grabbed the handset, the plastic familiar and cold. I gave the report, my voice sounding flat, distant, like it belonged to someone else. I said everything was quiet, everything was secure. I looked out at the road leading to the bridge, the road that had swallowed Miller, and I realized that I was lying. Nothing was secure, everything was gone. I sat there for hours, watching the shadows lengthen, watching the world change its shape as the light faded. I thought about the bugler again, the one on my grandfather's wall. I wondered if he had felt this hollow, burning emptiness, or if he had just been a cog in a machine that didn't care about his survival. I wondered if he had ever truly come home, or if he had stayed there on that field, blowing his horn into the silence, waiting for a response that would never come. I looked down at my hands. They were trembling again. I tried to steady them, to force them into a grip, but the shaking was deep, a tremors in my bones that no amount of willpower could suppress. I looked at the photograph of the girl in the yellow dress one more time. The light was failing, the sky turning a deep, bruised gray. I could see the details now, the way she was smiling, the way her hair was caught in the breeze. I felt a sudden, sharp ache in my chest, a physical pain that was almost hard to breathe through. I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw the photo into the dirt and stomp on it until it was nothing but dust. I wanted to tear the world down. Instead, I tucked the photo back into my pocket, right against my heart, and stared out into the darkening desert. I saw a movement near the horizon, a flash of something that shouldn't have been there, and my body reacted instantly. I raised my rifle, my finger resting on the trigger, my breathing slowing, my mind snapping into that cold, sharp focus that was the only thing I had left. I didn't care what it was. I didn't care why it was there. I was a soldier, and I was holding the line. The movement stopped. It was just the wind, shifting a tarp on an abandoned outpost, a piece of debris fluttering in the night. I lowered the rifle, my heart still pounding, my body humming with the adrenaline of a fight that didn't happen. I felt a sudden, overwhelming exhaustion, a fatigue so profound it felt like my blood had turned to lead. I leaned back against the wall of the tower and closed my eyes. The silence of the desert was absolute, a heavy, suffocating blanket that pressed down on me from all sides. I thought about Ohio. I thought about the porch, the screen door, the way the air smelled after a storm. I thought about Sarah. But those things felt like memories of another person, a boy I had once known and who had died on a bridge 1,000 miles away. I was someone else now. I was a man of dust and iron, a man who had seen the world break and who had stayed to watch the pieces fall. There was a sound then, faint and far off, a low, rhythmic thumping that seemed to come from the ground itself. I tensed, my grip tightening on the rifle, my ears straining to identify it. It wasn't the engine of a truck. It wasn't the wind. It sounded like the steady, heavy beat of a drum, a pulse that was getting louder, closer, more persistent. I climbed to the edge of the tower and looked out into the darkness. Nothing but the void, the starless, empty expanse of a land that refused to be known. But the sound continued, a throb in the ground that I could feel through the soles of my boots. I checked my watch. It was past midnight. No patrols were scheduled. No convoys were moving. I felt a flicker of that old, primal fear, the one that had sat in my belly since I first arrived, but it was different now. It was sharper, more defined, a cold, hard clarity that I hadn't possessed before. I radioed the base, my voice steady, professional, masking the rising tide of uncertainty in my chest. No answer, just static. I tried again, the desperation beginning to seep into my tone, but there was nothing, only the unending, empty hiss of the airwaves. I looked toward the horizon and I saw a light. It wasn't the light of a star or the flare of a distant fire. It was a rhythmic pulse, white and steady, moving across the desert floor toward the base. I watched it, mesmerized, a moth to a flame, and I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. My finger was on the trigger, my safety off, my heart a hammer in my chest. I knew I should sound the alarm, but my throat was frozen, my voice locked behind a wall of disbelief. I just stood there watching the light grow, watching it weave through the dunes like a ghost, a beacon in the wasteland. The light stopped at the edge of the perimeter. It wasn't a vehicle. It was a man. He stood there, alone, a dark silhouette against the white glow, his posture rigid, his head tilted slightly to the side. He held something in his hand, a long, thin shape that caught the light, and for a second my brain refused to process what I was seeing. It was a bugle. He stood in the center of the road that led back to the bridge, and he lifted the instrument to his lips. I watched, my heart stopped, my breath gone as he began to play. The sound wasn't a call to arms. It wasn't a fanfare. It was a long, mournful, achingly beautiful note that hung in the air, a sound that seemed to pull the very soul out of the night. It was the sound of everything I had lost, the sound of Miller, the sound of the girl in the yellow dress, the sound of the porch in Ohio. It was the sound of the bridge breaking and the sound of the world ending. I stared at him, my finger trembling on the trigger, my mind a storm of questions I couldn't articulate. Who was he? How had he gotten past the patrols? Why was he playing? The note ended, a long, fading tale that seemed to vibrate in the marrow of my bones. He lowered the bugle, his movements slow and deliberate, and then he turned and looked up at the tower. He looked straight at me. Even from this distance, I could see his eyes, or rather the absence of them, the way his face was just a mask of shadow. I felt a sudden, violent shiver rack my body, a cold that started at my feet and traveled all the way to the top of my head. He raised his hand, pointing at the base, at the perimeter, at me. Then he turned and began to walk away, his steps silent, his form melting into the darkness of the desert. I didn't fire. I couldn't. I just stood there, the rifle heavy in my hands, my chest heaving with the force of a million unsaid words. I watched until he was gone, until the light was swallowed by the void, until the desert was once again nothing but dust and shadow. The silence returned, but it was different now. It was heavier, charged with a meaning I couldn't name, a weight that felt like the end of everything I had ever believed. I climbed down the ladder, my movements mechanical, my mind a blur of static and terror. I walked to my barracks, the ground beneath my feet feeling like it was made of smoke. I crawled into my cot, pulling the wool blanket over my head, but the sound of the bugle followed me, a recurring, haunting echo that I knew would never truly leave. I lay there, my eyes open, staring at the dark, and for the first time since I'd arrived in this place, I wasn't waiting for the war to end. I was waiting for the end of me. The final weeks were a blurred montage of packing crates and inventory lists, the kind of mundane, soul-sucking paperwork that feels like an insult after you have seen the world burn. We were leaving, but the word didn't mean anything anymore. The definition of home had shifted until it was just a coordinate on a map I wasn't sure I could navigate back to. My squad, what was left of it, spent those last nights in a hollow, brittle silence. We sat on the tailgate of a transport truck and shared a bottle of warm water, watching the sky change color, saying nothing because to speak was to admit we were different people than the ones who had boarded the bus in Georgia 6 months prior. I didn't think about the flight home until I was actually on the plane, the C-17 cavernous and loud, the engine whine vibrating through the floorboards and into my teeth. I sat there, eyes closed, and when I saw her face, not the face of the woman I had left, but the face I imagined waiting for me, I felt a sudden, sharp spike of dread. I was afraid to show her the man who existed inside my skin now. I was afraid that if she looked too closely, she would see the shadow of the bridge and the dust of the desert and recognize that the man who had left wasn't the one who was coming back. The landing in America was a violent, jarring transition. The air felt too thick, too rich, too clean, like breathing after being underwater for a year. I walked out of the terminal and saw Sarah near the sliding glass doors, her coat buttoned up against a chill I couldn't feel. When she saw me, her face broke into a smile that was so bright it almost hurt to look at. She ran to me and the hug was real, the warmth of her body pressing against my chest, but I stood there like a statue, my arms hanging at my sides for a heartbeat before I forced them to wrap around her. It was the most beautiful and the most terrifying thing I had ever felt. That first night in our apartment, I didn't sleep in the bed. I ended up on the floor in the living room, staring at the ceiling, listening to the hum of the refrigerator. It was a domestic, civilized sound, but in the dark, it sounded like a dying engine. Every time a car drove by and its headlights swept across the wall, I flinched, my muscles coiling to push me into the dirt. I didn't tell her. I couldn't. How do you explain that your body is still at war even when you are lying in a king-sized bed with someone who loves you? The long quiet after was a war of its own, fought in the small, agonizing spaces of everyday life. I got a job at a warehouse, loading and unloading trucks, because the physical labor kept my hands busy and my mind from wandering to places I couldn't afford to visit. Sometimes at dinner, the clatter of a fork against a plate would spike my heart rate, and I would find myself gripping the edge of the table until my knuckles turned white, staring at the steam rising from the mashed potatoes. One night, months later, we were at my parents' place for a Sunday roast. My dad was telling a story about a lawnmower, and the room was filled with the easy, golden laughter of a family that didn't know what it meant to lose everything in 4 seconds. I started to laugh too, but I caught myself in the middle of it, the sound turning into a dry, jagged cough. I looked around the room, at the lace curtains, the porcelain plates, the warm, yellow light, and I felt like a spy in an enemy camp. I realized then that I would always be an outsider here, a man who had seen the other side of the veil and couldn't unsee it. The VA was a gray, windowless office where a counselor named Miller, a name that made me stumble before I even sat down, asked me to rate my anxiety on a scale of 1 to 10. I didn't give him a number. I told him about the bridge. I told him about the photograph of the girl in the yellow dress. I didn't cry and he didn't preach. He just nodded and wrote something on a clipboard, the scratching of his pen the only sound in the room. It didn't fix it. Nothing ever fixes it. but for the first time the memory wasn't something I was holding inside a locked room in my mind. It was something I had set on the table between us. I left the building and walked into the parking lot, the late afternoon sun hitting my face. I stopped by my truck and looked at the asphalt, at the lines painted in white, at the normal, boring, beautiful reality of a suburban Tuesday. I wasn't happy, and I wasn't the man I had been before, but I was still standing. I was still breathing. I started to run, not away from anything, but just to feel the blood moving in my legs, to feel the strain of my own heart instead of the terror of a heartbeat in a war zone. I ran along the river, the water gray and cold, the trees skeletal in the late autumn chill. It became my way of managing the weight. When the nights got too long, I ran until the exhaustion pushed the ghosts out of my head. I began to talk to Sarah too, not about the war. She wouldn't have understood the way the metal smelled, and I didn't want her to know, but about the quiet. I told her about Miller, about how he loved his sister, about how he was the best man I ever knew. I told her the truth without telling her the horror. She listened, and she didn't ask for more than I could give, and in that I found a different kind of hope. It wasn't the bright, blind hope of a boy, but the steady, iron-hard hope of a man who knows what can happen and decides to show up anyway. Today my life is small. I go to work, I come home, I eat dinner, I watch the news without sound. The tremors in my hands are mostly gone, replaced by a permanent, alert stillness. I still check the exits when I walk into a restaurant, and I still don't drive over anything that looks like a bump in the road, but I can sleep for 5 hours at a time now. I have a dog, a retriever that keeps me anchored to the present, and some days, when the light hits the kitchen floor just right, I can almost believe I'm finally home. I still keep the photograph of the girl in the yellow dress in my top drawer, tucked inside a folded letter from the service. I don't look at it often, but knowing it's there is like knowing where the heart is in a body. It reminds me of the cost, and it reminds me that survival isn't just about coming back, but about deciding what to do with the time that was left over. Last week we went to a park, and there was a kid playing on a swing set, the chains groaning in a way that pulled me right back to that day. I stood there, watching the movement, and for a second the world tilted, the air around me turning to dust. I felt the old, cold grip of the terror, the instinct to fall, to cover, to disappear. But then Sarah took my hand. She didn't say anything, she just squeezed, a small, firm pressure that grounded me to the grass and the trees and the sound of the wind. I didn't run. I stayed. I watched the kid push higher, his feet cutting through the blue of the sky, and I took a breath. It was a shallow breath, but it was mine. I looked at the swing, then I looked at the grass, and I realized that the boy I was on that bridge hadn't died after all. He had just gone quiet, waiting for the right moment to start living again. I think about the bugler sometimes, the man in the desert who played into the void. I don't know who he was or if he was real, but I understand the music now. It wasn't a warning, and it wasn't a ghost story. It was a way of marking the space where something important happened, a way of saying that even in the middle of a wasteland, there is a song to be played. I'm not the same man who left for that place, and I never will be, but there is a strange, quiet dignity in that. I have carried the bridge for years, and I have found that if you carry it long enough, it stops being a weight and starts to become part of the landscape you walk on. I still have hope, though it's different now, a quiet, specific hope that tomorrow will be just like today, that the sun will rise and that I will be here to see it. That is enough. That has to be enough. It is 2:00 a.m. now. The house is silent, and the coffee in my cup is cold, but the light coming through the window is starting to turn that soft, early morning gray that means the night is finally over. I'll go to work in a few hours, I'll talk to the guys in the warehouse, and I'll walk through the day with the weight and the memory and the quiet, and I will be okay. I've learned that you don't have to forget the things that broke you to be able to build something new out of the pieces. You just have to be willing to look at the mess and decide that it belongs to you, and that you are going to keep moving forward, one step at a time, until the road stops being a place of terror and starts being just a road again. The sun is coming up, the shadows in the corner of the room are retreating, and I am still here, and for the first time in a long, long time, that feels like the truth. I finally understand that the only way out is to carry the bridge with me until I'm strong enough to set it down.